We have Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Studies at JNU, now joining us on the broadcast. Professor Swaran Singh, we've seen riots and protests erupt in France, especially in the last couple of years, many of them since 2023. We've had several riots and protests last year, and this year too. We had protests from March leading up to May, and now it looks like, all the protesters seem to have united from the right wing to the left wing.
Indeed, the fundamental problem in France is that its public debt has rapidly increased. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. It today has the highest debt in European Union, 27 nations, and the debt has crossed about 110% of its GDP. Whereas the growth rate has not picked up in terms of momentum of economy. Second, there is a continuous political instability in terms of even in July of 2024, President Emmanuel Macron had declared snap elections, but the parliament came back with also again once again a divided mandate of its 289 seats. Which means, as you mentioned yourself, several prime ministers have been appointed in last 1 year only. Sebastian Lecornu is now the third prime minister to be appointed in last 12 months after Francois Bayrou faced no confidence motion, which again reflected the political instability. So the kind of deceleration of economy and political instability together have resulted in repeatedly Macron seeking out effort to push growth rate through tax cuts. And if he's doing tax cuts, he's also cutting on welfare schemes like in education and healthcare. In the budget, for example, there are proposed euro 44 billion worth of tax cuts which are being proposed. And that is what led to the no confidence motion also. So there is a constant instability both in the economy and in politics, which has resulted in enormous anxiety and anger. So as you mentioned, what was supposed to be originally a kind of a right-wing movement, and unions, workers' unions, called the Block Everything movement, has now expanded to include several other equally concerned stakeholders in French society and politics, which is generating even more greater social instability in that sense, making options for both is now appointed as the Prime Minister. Macron himself, though his own tenure in that sense, but enormous challenge to his leadership in France is very clear.
Professor Swaran Singh, at this stage, I wanted to ask, the protests in France and the outburst, of the protesters in France is, in a sense, if I can draw that parallel, help me if I can draw that parallel with what's happening in Nepal as well. Difficult economic conditions that is leaving huge sections of the population, in uncertainty and continuous uncertainty, and then add to that continuous political uncertainty as well, causing disillusionment in the entire system.
Yes, I think to a certain extent at the surface level, one can compare situation in Nepal, where again economic deceleration and political instability has resulted in grievances bursting out into sort of cross-country protests. The same thing is happening in France, in Bordeaux, in Lyon, in Paris, in so many. And I think the third angle which can be connected is information or misinformation, whatever way you want to call it, access to social media, instantaneously able to spread information or disinformation, which makes it often difficult for the state machinery to come into action with the same speed. Though reports are that about more than 80,000 security personnel has been deployed across various cities in France, including about 6,000 deployed in Paris itself, and of course several arrests made, 300 plus arrests made in France and in Paris itself, about 132 arrests are reported. So some clampdown is happening, but the explosive the speed of these kind of protests suddenly spreading across various cities often makes it difficult for state machinery to really cope up and address and contain it very quickly. Hope if situation all is expected to also be contained with the appointment of the new leader now. Hopefully, also in France, things could calm down perhaps over a period of time with the new prime minister being in place, and maybe he has something to contribute in ensuring stability in France.
Right. But Professor Swaran Singh, the common consensus seems to be that these are not protests only against,
Also, President himself has invested enormously his own prestige in foreign policy, particularly focusing on how to resolve the war in Ukraine. Where again, he's not had any sort of breakthrough in starting the peace talks, though he's invested enormously both in terms of diplomacy as also in terms of supporting Ukraine with equipment, financial assistance, and there were even repeatedly conversations of France actually sending foot soldiers to support Ukraine. So enormous investment even in foreign policy have not borne any sort of results, and domestically also repeatedly we have seen anxiety in grievances and protests and continuous political. There is definitely a view that perhaps he could continue and complete his term, but there is no political future in that sense for Emmanuel Macron. There is a view on that. But it's a larger issue also, I think, of national leaders, one after another examples around the world, are not being able to keep in touch with the ground in that sense as to how things rapidly are changing on the ground. What is the feeling and grievances popular masses sometimes have, which erupt into sudden explosive protests the way things are happening in France and are happening in Nepal, for example. And that, I think, is another major challenge for the political elite across the world to somehow make sure they're able to stay informed and stay in touch with things the way they are perceived on the ground, in the street, before things go completely out of control. And that is a problem that we are noticing in several countries, and each time there is a sudden eruption, there are examples where governments have fallen in neighborhood, for example, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, and now in Nepal.
right.
And used to think this was a problem of underdeveloped and least developed countries, which is clearly demystified here, with
Yeah.
France being emerging as another example where political instability and economic deceleration can create enormous chaos in the streets.
Right, Professor Swaran Singh there, putting that into perspective. Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Studies, JNU, speaking to us.